Hello and welcome back to the Sunday Long Read Podcast. I'm Jacob Feldman. We're thrilled to share the newest season of the podcast called Source Material. It's a series of stories about people whose stories went from print to screen. And this episode's actually a little bit different because our next guest made that transition himself from print to screen as a writer, going from someone who's worked in journalism to someone who's worked now in the wider world of entertainment for close to a decade pretty regularly now, across a number of TV shows that I'm sure you've watched, and working in a lot of IP that everybody has become familiar with. So we're talking Star Trek, we're talking Star Wars, and we're talking platforms like Amazon, Netflix, you name it. Before all of that, though, Marc Bernardin, our guest today, was a writer and editor at places like Playboy, The Hollywood Reporter, LA Times, Entertainment Weekly. So he made that jump, and it's exactly the jump we're going to be talking about. Marc, thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We could start in any number of places. I know you're a big fan of some of the early MCU comics of the 70s and 80s. We could probably spend the full time talking about today. But I want to jump ahead a little bit to the 90s, which I think is when your journalism career started. And I think it was a unique start for a lot of our listeners maybe had ideas of being a reporter or a specific kind of journalist early on and went after it. Yours was a little bit more coincidental as far as I can tell. Why don't you tell us how journalism came into your life as a professional?
I did not study journalism at all in college. The hope, the dream was to be some weird amalgamation of Spike Lee and Steven Spielberg. Like that's kind of where I wanted to be. I wanted to be a filmmaker, I wanted to be a storyteller. I was a nerd, so I wanted to do nerd stuff. And I needed 3 credits to graduate from college, from St. John's University in New York. And there happened to be an internship at a science fiction magazine called Starlog that would have given me those 3 credits. And it's like, hey, okay, I like words, I can write, and also I love nerd stuff, so this seems like a perfect fit. And so I did my summer internship. I had enough credits to graduate, and then they offered me a job. They were like, hey, you're decent enough at this. We pay next to nothing. Do you want to come and work here? And with no other alternatives on the horizon, I was like, absolutely, sure. Like I liked all the people. It seemed like most of the editors who worked there, was a very small editorial staff. When I was there were 3 of us. I think there were always 3 of us. It's like some kind of precog union where there's your editor, your editor-in-chief, and then you'd have 2 managing editors underneath them. All those managing editors would go on to be editors at DC Comics. Like that was the exit strategy.
The path. Yeah.
That was the path. And I was like, all right, that seems cool. I like comics. I'd like to do that. I'll take this job for a couple of years. I'll get the nod, and I'll go off and I'll edit comic books. I didn't get the nod. I was the guy who didn't get the nod. But instead I got an offer or an opportunity to join Entertainment Weekly. I think that would have been like 97, I think. And EW at the time it wasn't making any money for anybody. It would be a long time before EW made money for Time Inc. This was also the 90s in journalism, where it didn't matter because People magazine was there and Sports Illustrated was there and money was there. And, they were making all the money that anybody ever needed to make in journalism at all, period. So EW can kind of be on the fringes doing their dumb little, it's going to be a TV movie magazine. It's going to burn through cash like you wouldn't believe, but it doesn't matter because there's a swimsuit issue coming and it will sell 200 million copies on the newsstands and everybody will get rich. But yeah, that was my beginning. My beginning was not at all a planned entree into journalism. I came into it as a complete neophyte and learned everything that I learned on the job.
And at the time at Entertainment Weekly, when you started, what was the place that nerd culture, comic book culture, geek culture had, and how much was that what you were covering versus other topics?
It didn't have very much of a footprint yet.
Right.
We it was still 97. Like I think X-Men had come out, Blade had come out, but it wouldn't be until like 2002 or so when Spider-Man came out that it was like, oh, we need to care about this. I could talk about the influences of comics and manga and like kung fu movies on The Matrix and stuff like that, and I can talk about Twilight Zone when discussing like The Sixth Sense, like the big movies of '99, and Blair Witch Project. I knew quite a bit about horror because while working at Starlog, I was also an editor at Fangoria at the same time, and so. But EW in the '90s was this glorious place where it seemed like they were collecting nerds, but every kind of nerd. Like there was your musical theater nerd, your soap opera nerd, your prog rock nerd, your romance
Well,
novel nerd, your comic book nerd, your horror nerd. Like if you knew too much about a thing that nobody
mm,
else cared about, that was kind of the place for you and the time for you. And so I think I was the slightly like nerd who hadn't come into his own nerd yet because the magazine didn't care yet.
mm,
Um, but it was about to care in a big
yeah.
way. Um, yeah, but I fell into the sort of film
Mm.
zone. Like I that was my jam. Like I loved TV, but I was a movie kid from way, way
Mhm.
back. And so, when I first got there, I was an assistant editor on the movie review section and helping to do movie features. And then when I eventually got brought on staff full time, I took over the VHS review section. They called it just video review, but it was VHS, then the quick jump to Laserdisc, and then the eventual just digging into DVD. And then went out to the big movie reviews and then edited like the preview packages and that sort of thing. But it was a good time to be a nerd. It was a good place to be a nerd.
Yeah, what was it? You mentioned some of those turning points. What was it like to watch nerddom take over pop culture through those 2000s?
It was really fascinating because, I'm a nerd. I'm a Star Wars kid,
Hmm.
and so I remember all too well the long gulf between like Return of the Jedi and The Phantom Menace. Like 15 years we went without new Star Wars for real. Um, and so like nerd stuff and like Marvel hadn't taken off yet. There were
Right.
Spider-Man movies, but no, there was like a couple of odds. Like there was a Superman movie. Batman kind of took a break. After Batman and Robin, it would be
Yeah,
like 8 or 9 years between
it's
that
hard to
and
imagine now, but yeah.
yeah, there were just these whole years where you just didn't have superhero stuff, where you just didn't
Mhm.
have much science fiction. I mean, there was always a Terminator movie to happen, there was an Alien movie to happen, but it was definitely few or far between. It wasn't the pillar of Hollywood the way it would become. But the highs were always high. There was always like Jurassic Park or Men in Black or Terminator 2 or something like that that
Yeah.
reminded people that this was stuff, this was a genre that people, responded to in theater. But it was definitely not as all encompassing as it was now. And so figuring out how to explain to my bosses how we should be covering this stuff and that it was worth covering.
Mm.
The money helped. Like once Spider-Man makes $400 million, it's easy
Right.
to then have a conversation saying, hey, we should cover more comics, right? We should do a little bit more of this, right? Um, but it was always about like finding the best versions of it to cover. In covering comics, it was like, let's do a big thing about Watchmen's 20th anniversary.
Yeah.
Let's talk about Neil Gaiman's Sandman. Let's spend some of this, I'm not going to say influence, I'm going to say access that EW had on things that would exemplify the best of what that kind of genre had to offer. Um, and so, the job as an editor was it's always a taste making job. It's always like,
Mm.
hey, you know what I think is great? Battlestar Galactica. I feel like we should be covering this. Is anybody watching it? Well, no, it's on the Sci-Fi Channel, but it just won a Peabody Award, right? Like
Mhm.
that's shiny, isn't it? Like, can we begin to tell a larger readership that like here's some amazing stuff that you're not watching,
Mm.
maybe you weren't watching or listening to or reading because you had some weird blinder up against it, like you didn't, the name Battlestar Galactica had kept you from watching Battlestar Galactica, but once you did, you'd understand why we all care. It wasn't hard to explain to people why they should care about Lost,
Mhm.
because it did the job. Like it showed up on TV, like just raked in viewers by the armload, was the most popular, most talked about show on TV for a while. So, EW very much fancied itself as a magazine that gave you the talking points that you could have with your friends or your relatives or your colleagues or whatever to make you sound smart. And Lost specifically was like one of those shows where, man, how do I sound smart talking about Lost because I don't know what's happening. But yeah, I mean, it was always it was trying to make legitimate work out of the things that nerds always did, in their bedrooms or in their,
Mm.
in the back seats of cars or whatever it was, which was, why is this cool? Like, isn't this cool? How is it so cool? Why do we love it?
Yeah.
Um,
Did you feel like
it,
you were speaking to nerds or to people who you felt should be? Like, who were you thinking about as the audience at that point?
um, I mean, I think the thing that we realized is that, at EW, a lot of our readerships were either lapsed nerds
Mm.
Who like loved Star Trek and Star Wars when they were
Right.
kids and then went
And we're
on to
told to stop
become
caring about it. Yeah.
right. Like, we're going to throw away all your comic books. We're going to not let you play D&D anymore. We're going to turn you into a normal, upstanding member of society. Um, but I think we were able to kind of reignite some of that nerd love.
Mm.
And I think that people have it's not even like it's a dirty secret, but like people have a tendency to want to know more about the things that they love. Like they want they want information. They just want data. They want reference points. Like my son is not a nerd at all. It skips a generation, I think. Well, part of it is because children rebel against their parents,
Sure.
and the things that
Right,
parents
right,
love, they innately just tack against.
right.
But he loves fantasy football, and
Mhm.
I'm like, well, see, the same muscle that I'm exercising when I play Dungeons and Dragons, you are exercising when you play fantasy football. You've built a team. You're grinding stats. You're like there's one day a week where things happen that affect those stats. Like, granted, I'm doing it as a player, and you're just watching it as a passive participant. But even still, you got sheets full of numbers. I got sheets full of numbers.
It always comes back to the spreadsheet, no matter what.
It always
Yeah.
comes back to the spreadsheet. And so I think there is that thing inside of people that want to invest in content that rewards them for that investment. And science fiction and fantasy has always been a genre of ideas. It's always been a genre of the sort of cerebral, even when it's just like we're gonna shoot aliens with laser guns. Like, but there's still some element that's engaging you in a way that, say, even Falcon's Crest doesn't, or Friends doesn't, or name any just regular terrestrial TV show that's insanely popular doesn't engage that part of you. And I think we like it. I think humans sort of like that.
Yeah.
So it wasn't that hard to find a path to both speak to nerds about nerd stuff, but then speak to the regular Gen Pop about that stuff as well, and just twist their perception of what it was and what it could be.
And at the same time, you're finding time in the nights and the weekends to write some comics yourself, right?
Yeah, I mean, it was a thing that I'd wanted to do since I was like 10 or 11, is make comic books in addition to making movies. Couldn't draw to save my life, so that part went out the window. But I there was always stories that I kind of wanted to tell, or to try and get the chance to tell. And once I started covering comic books and started meeting the people who make comic books, and there's a bit of demystification involved, because I think every time you go to a piece of media, be it a movie or a TV show or a comic book or even a book, the thing you think is required to make that seems impenetrable and impossible and insurmountable, right? Like, how do I cross that barrier? How do we get over that hill? And for as much as I can do on my own, it seems 1,000 yards away. Until you go to a comic book convention, right? And then you meet artists and writers and editors and publishers, and comics specifically, the barriers between, professional and amateur, the barriers between, editor and aspirant are incredibly thin. So like, you could just go, and it helped that I worked at Entertainment Weekly. It helped that I was a person who's been championing comics on a larger scale. So when I would meet people, they would have some context for who I am. I'm not just a guy looking for a job. But so every now and again, somebody's like, "Hey, you can hit a deadline. You seem to be able to string sentences together, and you like this stuff. Do you ever think about writing comics?" And I'd say yes, since I was 12. Which meant that I then had to stop covering comics for Entertainment Weekly, because Time Inc. At the time, I don't even know if there is a Time Inc. anymore, but at least
not really. Yeah.
Not really. But back in the day, they took it very seriously, the idea of conflicts of interest and impropriety and crossing, these sort of boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. It was like, okay, I'm going to try writing comics. I'm going to stop covering comics. I'm going to hand this off to somebody else, and I'm going to see if I can live that dream. And so, yeah, it was nights, weekends, spent just kind of hoping to write things that anybody would care about, and hoping to come up with ideas that I could pitch and get a decent response to, and had the years of nobody cares, the years of rejections. But then a couple things clicked, and it I'm not going to say it turned into like this healthy side gig, but it allowed me to scratch that itch. It allowed me to, here's a passion that I thought was dead that now seems to be alive again. And so how can I feed it And then in turn, how does it feed me?
And you moved from that into TV. How did that transition take place there around, what is it, 2010, 2011?
Yeah, it happened twofold.
Mm-hmm.
One of them was a comic book that I had written called Genius.
Mm.
Caught the attention of an agent then at ICM, who I think moved very shortly after I met him to William Morris Endeavor. I was like, I think I can sell this to Hollywood. I think this could be a movie. I said, I'd like to see you try. And he tried and he failed because I knew he would. But then he was like, well, all right, well, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I was like, well, I think I want to work in TV. Like magazine journalism has instilled in me this love of teamwork, of working with other people, of together helping to tell a story. In magazines, you sit around a table. There's probably, depending on the size of the magazine, anywhere between 10 and 20 people on the table. There's the editor/managing editor at the head of the table. There's a bunch of smart people around it, all figuring out what stories we're going to tell in a week or in a day or in a month, depending on your circulation. And that is very much the experience of TV writing as well, where there's a showrunner, there's a bunch of producers, all the way from executive all the way down to staff writer, all trying to tell the same story. It's the showrunner's story we're trying to tell, but we're all solving these problems. We're all working together. We're all trying to figure out how to row in the same direction so that we're gaining speed and we're achieving clarity. And being an editor as a journalist, which is most of what my job was. Like I was a critic and I was a writer sometimes, but I was an editor at heart, is helping other people tell their stories, is helping them do that, not telling my story. Like it's like, listen, you pitched this, you're writing it, you did the reporting, this is yours. I'm just trying to help you tell it in the best way you can to make sure that your voice and your point is clear and to make sure that you're not stepping on your own toes with it. Like, let me help you shine. And that's the same job in a TV writer's room, which is, it's not my story, it's his story or it's her story or it's their story. And let me figure out how to tell it in a way that accentuates and amplifies the original intent. And so that when faced with what do you want to be when you grow up? Do I want to write movies and be by myself in my house and spend 3 or 4 months writing a thing that even in success will get butchered beyond recognition? Or do I want to work with a bunch of smart people telling a story and know that they're going to make it? You can write a movie that never gets made, even if it gets sold, even if it gets, Spielberg's attached to direct. Might never, ever happen. Totally. But if you get hired on the staff of a TV show, 95% of the time, they're making that show. Yeah. Like you're going to write something that somebody will shoot. And that is intoxicating, and I like getting paid weekly or at least regularly. I like there being office to go into and they're going to buy me lunch. And I like there being supplies I can liberate and take home with me. Like there were enough similarities in those two jobs that's kind of where I went. He did not sell that thing, but he said, if you want to be a TV writer, you got to write a pilot. You have to come out to Los Angeles for meetings. And if you get a job, you're going to have to move in like 72 hours. Because
you were in New York at the time.
I was in New Jersey at the time, but publishing, in the 90s and in the 2000s, like if you weren't in New York, you really quite weren't doing it. And I did all those things and I wrote a pilot that in retrospect is not very good, but good enough. I went out for a week full of meetings and I got a job offer on a Friday and I needed to be in the room on a Monday. And so I had to uproot at least my family did not move with me because I'm like, listen, this is a temp gig. And so I'm not going to pull kids out of school for a temp gig. Like there needs to be a bit more momentum before we actually consider a full-on, transcontinental move. But I can do it for a couple of months. And so, so that's what I did. It sucked and it was amazing. It was all of those things at once. But yeah, that was the path.
Hello, I'm Albert Samaha. I'm an award-winning journalist at The Washington Post, author most recently of the book Concepcion, and the guest editor of the Sunday Long Reads True Crime Spotlight newsletter. Check out our monthly newsletter, where I'm curating the best true crime stories, from thrilling narratives through little-known underworlds to investigations that expose corporate or police misconduct. You can subscribe at sundaylongread.com/truecrime. That's sundaylongread.com/truecrime. Hope you'll join us. Peace.
Tell me what life was like, then, and if it's different now in a writer's room around that table that had hoped to sit at.
I mean, the first time in a writer's room is flummoxing
Mm.
because there's all of these, it's a writer staff is anywhere between 7 and 10 people. There's a couple of assistants that help, sometimes it's a bit smaller, sometimes it's a bit bigger, but generally that's where you are. And as the youngest, well, that's not true because I showed up as like a 42-year-old person, but as the least experienced person on that
Yes.
staff, you don't know where to sit. You don't know when you're supposed to talk. You're like, it's like going to summer camp. There's all these
Right.
people that you're meeting for the first time, and you got to make friends again, which most people, after you hit a certain age, you kind of forget how to do that. Like, oh, okay, I gotta make small talk. I gotta, and also be incredibly honest at the same time with
Mm-hmm.
folks because, personal narrative is kind of the coin of the realm. Like, yes, you can write, yes, you can whatever, but we are going to mine the depths of your personality and your experience and your soul to then put on screen, even if it's a show about superheroes or monsters or devils that come back from parallel dimensions or whatever it is. Um, and just the discipline of engaging in a conversation for between 5 and 7 hours without wandering, like, and even back when I mean, in 2010, 2011, when I made the first jump, it was like, we had phones, sure, but it's like I'd been multitasking for, 20 years. And suddenly I got to just sit here and listen and just, okay, we're all talking. We're all having one conversation. I can't wonder about lunch. I can't wonder about the flight I'm going to catch home the next day to see the kids. I can't think about, traffic on my way to or from because then I lose the thread of the conversation. The thread is the story. And that's the job, is to be able to listen to that conversation and contribute when you can, fire ideas if you have them. But the minute you lose that thread, you're like, what am I doing here? And so I had to train myself. It took like a week to figure out how to just listen again. Um, and when to speak, and when to pitch. And, as a newer staff writer, there was no expectation of you to suddenly show up with answers, but like you had to contribute in some way, you know, and I don't think I was good at it at first. I don't think many people are, which is like, how do I take the thing that's in my head that's somewhat amorphous and not really concrete in any way and find a way to express it in a fashion that's helpful to anybody else listening, and that doesn't sound dumb and that doesn't sound ridiculous, except dumb and ridiculous is sometimes what you need.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing you think you're supposed to have is all the answers. But the truth is, as long as you're adding something that somebody else can then spin into something else that somebody else can take, and it's like an improv game,
Yeah.
you're yes-anding the whole time. That's also helpful. It's just,
Mm-hmm.
it's figuring out how it works, and it's figuring out who does what, and it's figuring out how much is expected of you and how much isn't. And that took a while, but
Mm-hmm.
it was all fun. It was all so much fun because everybody cares. Like even the veteran, even the grizzled old hands who are just like, man, I was on Parker Lewis Can't Lose. And let me tell you what it was like back in the 80s. Even those, they still care, right? Yeah, they get paid an exorbitant amount of money, but they do it because they love it. They do it because it's fun and because they're good at it. And just watching people who you wouldn't think to look at them care this deeply about dumb shit, dig into it. It's kind of inspiring.
For reporters and writers, there's a set series of milestones, like you're mentioning. You get your first staff job, you get your first, whether it's front page story at a newspaper, cover story at a magazine. When you join the world of TV writing, what is it? Is it the first quote that shows up that you wrote? Is it the first arc? Is it the first episode? What is that milestone? Like, I can actually hang with these folks and contribute something here.
I mean, the first big milestone for really reels is screen credit.
Mm-hmm.
Did you write a draft that was good enough for your name to still be on it?
Mm.
Now, most of the time, even if it's a bad draft, your name will still be on it because, a good showrunner understands that, hey, you're learning it, and your job as a staff writer is not to deliver a draft that's amazing. Like, the pay and the rank and the title is commensurate with how much experience you have and how good your drafts can be expected to be when you turn them in. But even still, having like having your name on the screen is huge. Even before that, having a pitch in the room that makes it onto the big whiteboard and stays there is pretty great. It's like, you know what, that was mine. You know, you won't. It's nothing that I wrote, like, you know, fingers to keyboard. It's nothing that ever appeared on paper that I had anything to do with. My name isn't even on that draft, but I know that I pitched that idea, and everybody on the staff knows that I was in that room when that happened, and that was my idea. Whether or not it sort of fades and becomes part of whoever's script that was, and the osmosis of a writer's room begins to, it absorbs more than it returns. But even still, it's the first idea that you pitch that ends up on the board. It's the first draft that you turn into your showrunner who says, you know what, we used most of this. Like, this is pretty good.
Yeah.
It's that first time you hear your actual dialogue. You know, when you see dailies from when they shot the episode, and you're like, they're saying my words.
Mm-hmm.
This is ridiculous that they're saying my words, even though the first cut of every episode is awful, and you'll probably want to crawl into a corner and cry. But even still, it's like they're saying the words. And then it's when it airs, and you can screen grab the credit that appears on the televisions. It's a bit like, I imagine, when you're you're a musician and you hear your song on the radio, where it's like, look, it's gone out. It was good enough to get out to the world, and other people are ingesting it. And, you know, it's whether or not one chooses to go on the internet and see how people feels about it. That's entirely dependent on your own level of desire for self-sabotage and masochism. But it's possible. But no, those are the things, really. Those are the like, and then, you know, if you're lucky enough to get, you know, you get a parking spot with your name on it on a motion picture lot, like that's that old timey Hollywood, like, you know, Clark Gable and Cary Grant had parking spots.
Yeah, right.
Somebody came with a stencil and put my name on concrete.
What was the first show where you got that?
I've never gotten that.
Oh, yeah.
I've
That's
never
still on the bucket
gotten
list, huh?
Yeah.
I know you've gotten the Office plaque, right? I saw that for Star Trek at the very least.
I've gotten the Office plaque on a couple of shows. Star Trek was the coolest, because they did come around and say, all right, well, which captain do you want to be on your plaque? You know, and there's a fair number of captains you can choose.
It's a hard choice. Yeah,
it's a hard choice. There's a lot of ways you can go, but to have your name, and it's to have your name involved in a thing that you've cared about for a while. You know, sometimes they're new shows, sometimes they're, I mean, Star Trek Picard was very specifically like the return for me of like Next Generation was my Star Trek. I watched the classic show. I love the classic show, but it was my dad's Star Trek. Next Generation was my Star Trek. And so to eventually, some 20 or 30 years later, get to actually work on it, and to write dialogue for Batman, like that was something.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a little bit. I wanted to go back slightly to, because you continue to do some writing, some journalism through the 2010s at places like THR, Playboy, LA Times. One of the columns that our team came across was at The Hollywood Reporter about Elon Musk, which I think was 11 years ago, so around 2013. And you had compared him to some of the comic supervillains that you had come up being familiar with and pointing out. I'm curious how that column came about, and more generally, how you feel like comic book thinking or storytelling came to affect your way of seeing the world and then writing about it as well.
You know, I don't quite remember the specific genesis of that, other than I'm sure that he had done something.
I think it was
ridiculous.
around the Hyperloop. Yeah, some crazy idea.
Yeah, you know, and I remember my friends and I were like, is he a demon who's just invented a very, very expensive way to funnel souls into hell? Like, the Hyperloop, you guys, I swear it's going to work. I'm spending billions of dollars to make a conveyor belt for souls to just literally go straight to hell. It's fine. Just get on. It'll be okay. You know, and we would have believed him.
People, would.
11 years ago, when, you know, he was being compared to, like, Tony Stark and Elon Musk were about the same thing. You know, and Elon even, art. Yeah. Right. And Elon even shows up in Iron Man 1, I think, at a party scene. And, I mean, we have since learned more about Elon Musk. And so I don't think that comparison quite holds. But that feeling of, you know, life imitating art, imitating life, and how we had crossed this Rubicon of now comic books being, almost as lingua franca that we all had, where we could all kind of speak comic book. Like Marvel taught everybody how to speak comic book, and so,
Yeah.
there was, and there's always been, I've always been fascinated by the ways in which comics and pop culture and class and race kind of
Mhm.
intersect and interact with each other.
Mhm.
And so, when I started writing a column for THR, well, that was kind of specifically the jumping off point, was
Yeah.
like, how does nerd culture interact with all of these other parts of our culture that we are now beginning to reckon with in real ways? Like this was even pre COVID lockdown. This was even pre, we're having a national reckoning
Mhm.
that has since come and gone, but whatever. And so, but nerddom is a microcosm through which you can then begin to extrapolate the ways the rest of the world kind of works. It's not quite a closed community, but it's definitely a community that and watching the way fans reacted to, say, Sam Jackson as Nick Fury instead of George Clooney as Nick Fury. The way they reacted to John Boyega holding a lightsaber as compared to anybody else holding a lightsaber. The way they reacted to Kelly Marie Tran just existing in Star Wars.
Mhm.
The way you could look at the litany of people who were hired to make Star Wars films, and it was, in 40 years there was one woman um, above the line, who co-wrote Empire Strikes Back, and otherwise everybody was a white dude with a beard and a baseball hat. And so you get to have conversations about who is this for? Like, who is nerddom for? Who gets to participate? Who gets to have their stories told? And I thought all of those were interesting conversations to have. And THR was good enough to understand that, I mean, this is also the hot take economy. So having things that you could somewhat portray as a little bit incendiary
Sure.
in display copy was good for them.
Yeah.
But even still, to be able to have conversations about, like, can Batman ever be a black person?
Mhm.
Could Bruce Wayne ever be a black person, not Batman? And I'm like, I don't know. I don't think so. He's got to be old money. there's there's not a ton of old black money, at least not at that
Yeah.
level. And so, I think that they specifically, and I think it's a thing that I've tried to do over the course of my career, is have these
Mm.
conversations about, how nerddom affects the world depending on who you are in the world.
Mhm. Yeah. For you personally and professionally, how did you feel that those conversations affected the types of gigs, the types of stories people expected from you or were asking you to write over the last 10 years?
Um, I think I think there was a thing you could call, like, the Black Panther effect,
Right.
which is like, hey, so this thing is coming, and
Mhm.
we'd like to be able to write stories about it that feel informed and specific and cultural. And turns out most of our editorial staff does not have a natural inclination towards Black Panther.
Mhm.
Basically it was lots of organizations realizing that they had kind of failed at preparing for a
Mm.
moment like this.
Mm.
And so I knew a lot of freelance journalists, a lot of staff journalists, a lot of whatever, who, like, it was like a gold rush where, like, everybody wanted something and now was your time,
Mhm.
and so it and for me it has existed a little beyond the Black Panther of it, because I have just enough time and just enough skin in the game to have existed for a while. But even still, when it was time to have a conversation about race, or time to have a conversation about inclusion or diversity or whatever, like, I was the guy that they called, which is fine. Like, it's not, and to me, it's not the worst thing in the world to have a skill and a talent and an area of expertise and then be able to monetize that. Like, if you know a lot about knitting and suddenly, like, hey, Anne Hathaway was seen knitting a thing and everybody wants to talk about knitting and now you're the knitting person, and, Vogue wants to have conversations about knitting, then, like, yeah, you take that call, you write that piece. Um, it just so happened that for me, that knitting was diversity,
Mhm.
and superheroes and laser beams and robots and time travel.
Yeah.
Um, and it never bothered me. It occasionally does. I know why it's happening,
Mhm.
and it'd be great if the reasons why it happens were lesser,
Sure.
but it didn't bother me to, like, Marvel asked me to write a Black Jedi comic book. Like, okay, they haven't asked me to write a White Jedi comic book, but maybe it's coming, maybe it isn't. But I also understand it, and don't fault them for it, because for the longest time they wouldn't have even asked me, or anybody who looked like me. So incremental baby steps, I think, kind of across publishing are good, and I'm happy to engage them when they come my way.
I want to ask kind of about the broader art of adaptation. We were just talking about Star Wars. We mentioned Star Trek. I think you've worked on projects related to D&D, related to He-Man, related to these, iconic pieces of IP stretching back decades. I'm curious for you how you feel like you've learned the way to, literally to adapt, to find what's in there that maybe should be expanded upon or changed slightly. What is that process for you when it comes time to tell a story in a world that already exists?
It varies depending on the task of the adaptation. Like here's a specific book we're doing, right? Here's a literal, like it exists as this discrete piece of information that now we have to transfer into another medium, and I think that I always fell back on the William Goldman method of adaptation, where his plan, as he delineated in his book, Adventures in Screen Trade, was he'd read a book once, he'd put it down, then he would tell the story that he remembered to someone else. And the parts that he remembered were the parts that needed to be in the adaptation, because that's the stuff that he felt personally drawn to. That's what I feel is exciting. This is what I feel is dramatic. If I didn't mention it, if I skipped over it, I don't need it. And then he would go back to the book and then start to highlight stuff and begin to assemble what for him was, this is what was necessary to sort of to save. And here's where the invention comes, is stitching those things together in the spirit of the work. I think like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings does that incredibly well, where it's like, oh yeah, you almost don't miss the things that aren't in there. And you've come to perceive the things that are new as having always been there, because the spirit of the work remains. That's a different challenge than like Castle Rock, which was we're writing like the lost Stephen King book. Right? Like it needs to feel like it's Stephen King. It needs to feel like it's in the world. It needs to have the tropes and the rhythms and the pattern and the characterization of Stephen King, but there's not a specific thing we're pulling from. That becomes like a seance almost. That becomes like, all right, well, what do we know about Stephen King? What do all of these stories do? How do they function? What's the rhythm of them? Like, does Stephen King engage in secrets and mystery? And working on that show where J.J. Abrams was one executive producer, and then you meet Stephen King. J.J. loves a mystery box. What is it? Don't know. What's happening, Alan? Don't know. Stephen King, he puts it in the title. What is it? It's Cujo. It's Carrie. It's Christine. Like what? It's a dog just who's infected with rabies. It's a car that's
a haunted cell phone. Yeah,
it's whatever it is. Like he will tell you exactly what it is in the first chapter or two. What's happening. And then the rest of it is a character piece. Like, how does this crazy supernatural thing affect these normal people? And so finding ways to synthesize those together as cohesive story was the job. But I think it ultimately all comes down to like, what's the spirit of this work? Like what does it by itself want to be? And then how do you manage to pull the things that are special out of it and retain them and preserve them? While either telling a new story or telling the version of this other story that's the most maximized for the medium that it's in. Yeah. Like I'm adapting a Neil Gaiman novel right now called Anansi Boys from prose to comic book form. And like, it's got to be different because you can do things in prose you can't do in comics. You can show things in comics you can't do in prose. And so finding that mixture, that alchemy that lets you do the best of both worlds, that lets you take what you loved from the book and then find ways to add some things that are interesting and new and different connective tissue to get to the same beats. Like, I always feel like I'm a doctor. Like, all right, first do no harm. Like, we're not going to cut things that don't need to be cut. We're not going to suture things that don't need to be sutured. Like, what's the least invasive way we can do this? Because if you love the book, you kind of want the book, except you want surprises as well. And so like, how do you deliver the expected and the new at the same time?
Yeah. It's It's interesting hearing you talk about that. I, write a fair amount about tech in my day job, tech and sports, and there's a lot of conversation obviously around AI, artificial intelligence, and I think a lot of what people see them doing is some form of what you're talking about, right? Of like, what if Stephen King wrote about Facebook, and it like creates a story. I'm curious, kind of, I don't know if you've played with any of those tools or if you have thoughts on kind of what that could do, or well or poorly, when it comes to taking existing material and putting it in a new format.
I think that the thing AI will never give you is the idea you don't already have. So like if you go to AI with, I really want to hear Alice in Chains' version of Jolene,
mm-hmm.
You showed up with Alice in Chains and you showed up with Jolene.
Yeah.
And the tech can make that happen for you. You are still the person who's having these ideas, but AI is never going to give you the red wedding in Game of Thrones. It is never going to surprise you with, it's never going to kill Ben Kenobi, right? Like it's never going to take these wild jags off into the story that even the writer surprised happened while he's writing, because that's the creative process, the thing you don't expect. And AI is awful at that, because all it does is give you what you expect. It gives you what you asked for. And great story is almost never asked for. It's always like, okay, I guess this is happening now. And so, and I remember when I was on the picket lines during the WGA strike, one of my favorite signs that I saw more than once is AI never had its heart broken. AI never went through a parental divorce. Like AI has no trauma, and trauma is what makes drama possible. It's what makes comedy possible. It's what makes any kind of human entertainment possible. Is the person who thought this up is broken in some way, and they've healed poorly, and the result of that heal is this story that I'm telling. And so like while I am afraid of the insistence that some companies and some sectors of our business might have in implementing AI, I'm not actually terribly afraid that it'll work, because it kind of can't. There's what it'll do, sadly, is it'll get rid of the people who help make those things interesting. Like it'll get rid of concept illustrators and production designers and costume designers, because there's some filmmaker or some executive who thinks, if I just tell the box what I want, it'll give me what I need. I don't have to talk to these other 12 people who actually invent the stuff out of thin air, unless there's a filmmaker who demands it. Unless there's a showrunner that demands it. But, it's the lowest common denominator will start to win, even though secretly the lowest common denominator is the executive jobs who are deciding what to green light and not green light. And that stuff feels like the things you could most easily outsource.
Right.
And yet you guys want to get rid of writers, but okay. Okay.
Yeah.
I think it's a tool. And like every tool, I think it requires discipline for use, and it requires an understanding of what it's capable of, and it requires some safeguards from some body that controls it, especially when a tool has incredible awe-inspiring power.
Fantastic. Well, you're a busy man. I really appreciate you taking time, Marc. Thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Thank you. This was a blast. I appreciate it.
Of course. This episode of the Sunday Long Read podcast is produced by Atreya Verma and Etienne Lajoie. The co-founders of the Sunday Long Read newsletter are Jacob Feldman and Don Van Natta. If you like the podcast, you can support us by following us on your favorite platform, or all of them. And make sure to check out the newsletter if you haven't already. You can subscribe at sundaylongread.com/subscribe. Until then, talk soon.